thinking about what we mean by resilience and why it's important, particularly in this day and age. And the definition that I'm using for this webinar is to think about resilience as being a range of skills and behaviours and attitudes that help us in the development of mental toughness. We've called it the ability to deal with and bounce forward from challenges, pressures and stress in both personal and professional environments. You might wonder why I've put bounce forward from rather than bounce back. There is a sense, if we think about bouncing back from a difficult situation or a setback or a challenge, that gets us back to where we were before. We bounce back to the position we were in, perhaps back into the situation that created the stress, and maybe we have not moved forward and not learned from that situation. So the concept of bouncing forward indicates that there's been some movement, some growth, and that has resulted from the learning that we've gone through in that stressful situation. And what do we mean by resilience? Well, some of the experts will say to us that people are helped by a particular pattern of attitudes and skills that help them to survive and thrive under stress. The three main ones that seem to emerge from a lot of the different work that's been done around this are three C's: commitment, control, and challenge. As times get tough, if we can build and hold on to those three particular sets of attitudes, beliefs, behaviours, we're likely to learn and grow and bounce forward rather than be overwhelmed by the stresses and the challenges that we're facing. So what do we mean by those? Well, commitment is about hanging in there. It's about staying involved, staying committed to the people and the events around you, rather than trying to run away from those or back out. It's also about having a sense of control, where we keep trying to influence the outcomes in which we're involved. And we know for sure that a lot of people experience the most stress when they're in situations where they feel they have the least control. So how do we find the elements that we do have some control over and influence those things? And then thirdly, how can we treat these situations as challenges? Yes, they may be quite daunting, but it is possible to work through them, and we can respond positively to those challenges. So how do we develop those? At RSVP Design, those of you who have worked with us and know us and may know some of our materials, you'll be aware of the fact that wherever possible, we use practical activities. Those activities to focus on two things, really: to focus on raising awareness of what's going on around us and what we need to do, and then providing opportunities to rehearse and refine new ways of thinking and behaving. And in relation to resilience, one of the exercises that we do, and I want to just sort of talk you through and give you a little flavour of that now, is an exercise that involves imagery and metaphor. We use a set of picture cards that we call images of resilience. And these pictures represent two different aspects of resilience: the situations that require it and some of the strategies that we can start to develop to help us to become more resilient. So you should be able to see 4 pictures on the screen here. And I'd like you just to look at those illustrations and see what they suggest to you. So just take a moment and have a look at those. These are a selection of the cards that illustrates some of the situations in which we might need resilience. And I think it's fairly obvious as we look at them. The image on the left indicates task overload, urgent deadlines, demands being made, alarms, all sorts of things to do with a high-pressure working environment, particularly one where people are being pulled in different directions because of the different demands that are being made on them. The second one, with the dark shadow at the front, potentially that represents being at a crossing point. Maybe the fact that stress is coming from the fact that we have a target, but that target appears to be a long way out of reach. The trophy in the middle of the maze, we know that we want to get to it, we have a clear idea of what the goal is, but is it possible for us actually to achieve it? And then finally, situation in which there seem to be numerous barriers to success, obstacles being placed in our way, perhaps deliberately. So these are just some of the situations that people might observe from the imagery. If we move on to look at the next set of images, here are some of the things that potentially might be helpful to us. And again, just take a moment and have a look at the images there. We use the imagery to get people to think about what the concept of resilience means, and some of the, perhaps starting to think of some of the skills and strategies that will help them to move forward. And these are some of the things that have been identified. 6 core competences crucial to resilience. Self-awareness. What we mean by that is people being aware of and able to understand their own thoughts and feelings, recognizing what's happening in their minds and their bodies. Self-regulation that enables them to have a degree of ability to manage those and not let those feelings and reactions become overwhelming. A sense of optimism, mental agility, a recognition of your own character strengths, the ability to play to those strengths, thinking about a strengths-based approach, not what I'm struggling with or what I can't do, but what I can do and what I'm capable of. And also strong connections, strong relationships with other people. And if we think about those in terms of skills, those skills perhaps identified as mindfulness, that sense of awareness, the skills that enable us to be in control and to influence, the ability to collaborate with other people, to work independently, but to know when we need others, the ability to step back, take some distance from a situation and reflect on it, the ability to learn and to set realistic goals to enable the next learning to happen, and that sense of positive thought and action. And then we might ask, why does an experiential learning approach particularly help in building resilience? And I think it's quite interesting that for those of you that are familiar with the experiential learning process, you start to recognize that that in itself uses and rehearses many of the skills that have been identified as supporting personal resilience. If you think about the process of experiential learning, it is mindful and reflective. It requires people to be aware of what they've done, to take time to think about that and consider it. It's collaborative in that very often the process of debriefing and reflecting involves feedback and other people's opinions and observations. And it's strategic. It sets positive new goals to work towards. And just in a little bit more detail, we think of the experiential learning cycle that some of you will know. That idea of the concrete experience. This is the situation I'm in. It may well be stressful. It may well be challenging. It's always personal, it's always relevant because it's your experience. And that experience enables you then to move to the next stage of the learning process. This is where mindfulness comes in. This is where reflection and distance comes in. The ability to step back, create distance, mindful attention, thoughtful, non-judgmental reflection. And then having done that, we move to abstract conceptualization. This is where we start to make sense of the situation we're in, where we use positive thought, we think about what we've gained from the situation, we start to begin to put some personal theory to that, and that enables us to think about what we need to do differently, the new action, the realistic goal setting. And then, of course, the active experimentation, which is often collaborative, and it's designed to support a positive future experience. So when we go back and think about some of the skills that we need to become more resilient, in the very process of helping people to understand their own learning, we're actually alongside that, helping them to think about becoming more resilient. What I want to do briefly now is just to introduce you to 3 short activities that are examples of the kind of things that we do at RSVP. Now, you may be familiar with these already, but it's quite possible that you haven't used them in the context of resilience. And the first one that I'd like to take you to is a very simple activity that we have called workstations. Some of you may know it. Workstations involves a pack of cards. Each card has information written on it. There are 30 cards and the information is dispersed, divided up amongst the group members with a pretty ambiguous, uncertain task. We simply say to the group, your job is to work together, to communicate together, to share the information in order to solve a problem or achieve a task. And the task is actually embedded in the information. So, for example, one of the group's tasks is to decide who goes to a cafe to eat their lunch. The content, the information in workstations is almost irrelevant. It's a logic process. What we tend to experience when people begin the task like workstations is that they're initially overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed because they have too much information, they have an uncertain task, everyone has a different opinion about how they should move forward, they don't know where to begin. I ran this exercise on an induction training for new staff in a big organization, high pressure positions. And many of them said, this exercise represents those feelings of going into a new, stressful, uncertain situation where you're struggling to think, where do I begin? They described it as like starting a new job. You have so much to learn and you don't even know the right people to ask or even the right questions to ask. As the group work together, they start to recognize that there are some key things they can do that will make this situation much more manageable. And they do a number of different things. And I'm just looking at some notes I've made here because it's quite important, some of the things that emerge from the exercise. This is very much about the control element of becoming resilient. It's about gaining a sense of control. And within this exercise, the way that groups and individuals start to get control is by doing a number of things. They begin to clarify an ambiguous goal. So what do we know about the task? What is it that we've actually got to achieve here? They begin to create a process and a structure that is going to work for them. So they determine who's going to speak. They determine how they're going to manage the information. They gather all the available data. They recognize that they need to know what resources they have, what information they have. Having access to the information that they need. But then they also begin to allocate some of that information. So they give responsibility to individuals to memorize or to find a system for remembering the information that they need. They disperse the knowledge and they reduce the pressure upon themselves to try and keep everything under their own control. They recognize that it's being controlled by the people around them. They also start to make connections between the individual pieces of information. And as they build those connections, they see the bigger picture that they're working with. And as they see the bigger picture, they begin to feel as though, I'm not working in the dark here. I'm beginning to understand how this works, and I'm beginning to understand where my bit fits. They ask questions. And as their understanding of the task develops, they ask more appropriate questions. They clarify, they summarize, they confirm expectations. What do people need me to do with this information? How is that going to be used and how is it helpful? So all of these things are a kind of rehearsal for managing something that we can manage. The information available to us, the knowledge that we have, and we can create systems and mechanisms for feeling as though we're in control rather than overwhelmed by the volume of information. And we notice that happening through this exercise. They begin to feel more confident to influence what's going on as they start to understand the structure of the game, as it were, and they start to see the connections. They begin to be able to suggest new approaches. And in those positive new approaches, the collaboration allows them, in most situations, to get to an effective result. So I'm citing this as an example of an activity that is helping people to think about, what can I do to influence and take control of particularly the volume of information and demands that are being made on me, and create simple structures in order to help us to feel more in control. So that's one example of one aspect of resilience. Another exercise that, again, some of you may be familiar with is an activity we call challenging assumptions. Now, challenging assumptions uses jigsaw pieces. You can see them in the pictures, and I've got a couple of pieces here. The activity creates a jigsaw puzzle, about A4 size, of interlocking pieces. When we set up the exercise, we simply pour these pieces onto the table, and we ask a small group to work together in order to find a way of building the puzzle. And as they go into it, they do what we would all do if we were asked to build a jigsaw puzzle. They turn pieces over, they sort them, they look for known pieces, corners, straight edges. And then after a while, they realize that they're struggling. The puzzle doesn't come together in the way that they expected. And over time, quite a high level of frustration can build, and they begin to question whether the activity is actually achievable. It is. It always is. The jigsaw pieces are two-sided, and in order to complete the puzzle, they need to work with some of the pieces in a way that appears to be upside down. So the brown side, if you can see that in the video there. If you look at the pictures on the screen, every group I've worked with, and I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times, one of the first things they do is they turn the pieces so that they're coloured side up, because it's obvious there is a right side and a wrong side. So it seems. Within the time that they take in the exercise, they need to get to a point where someone recognizes that the old pattern of thinking, the old assumptions they're making about how the jigsaw puzzle works, isn't going to work for them now. And usually they reach a point where people turn over a piece, they start to experiment, and they get the breakthrough of discovering that the pieces need to turn. Even when they've done that, there's a degree of persistence and determination needed, because the puzzle is quite complex to assemble. So that's a brief description of how the puzzle works. In terms of resilience, there is a strong element of keeping going with this. And it's interesting watching, because some people will very quickly give up and others will put their heads down and keep working on the puzzle. They'll want it there at lunchtime, they'll want it there at the end of the day, because they're not satisfied until it's completed. But persistence with this puzzle simply isn't enough. And there are other things that they need to do. And these are some of the aspects, again, of resilience. In order to bounce forward, as I talked about at the beginning of the exercise, in order to bounce forward, sometimes we need to let go. We need to realize that the things we thought were truths might be assumptions, that the things that have worked for us in the past aren't necessarily going to work for us as we move forward, and that we need to reflect on the learning process that we're involved in. And as we debrief this exercise, and as we question some of those assumptions, the participants, the students, start to recognize that sometimes the assumptions they're making and that the patterns of behavior and the patterns of thought that they're holding on to are actually generating some of the stress and pressure that they're feeling. And it may be that if they can let go of some of those, they'll start to feel more comfortable about moving forward. So by asking them to think about what were the helpful assumptions, what were the ones that hindered, what do they need to do in order to move into new situations. It's okay sometimes to say something that's worked for me and been successful for me in the past isn't working now, and that is no reflection on them or their ability, but it's situational. The environment they're working in has changed. Maybe they need to think differently. So this is a nice little example of an exercise that has in it a lot of the elements of resilience. Yes, perseverance, persistence, not giving up. Believing that there is an achievable goal at the end of this, that they haven't been set an impossible task. Looking for new patterns, recognizing that we need to find a different way of tackling this. If we keep hitting the same old problem with the same stick, it's not going to go away. Just as a little aside, one of the elements, obviously, of resilience is this determination to persevere, to continue with something. But that in itself may not be a particularly useful or helpful trait in all situations. A few years ago at RSVP Design, we were working with a group of researchers from Bristol University, the School of Education, who were doing a major piece of work about how people learn. And they, as a result of this work, identified 7 different dimensions of learning, and resilience was one of them. And resilience in their terms was very much about keeping going, not giving up, try again, all of those traditional thoughts of what we might mean by being resilient. They used an assessment process and a questionnaire, and they assessed the ability of learners against the 7 dimensions they'd identified. And one of the groups of learners that they came to was a group of young people in young offenders institutions, kids who were in trouble, had been in trouble with the police, who were struggling with difficult lives in many ways. And the questionnaire results showed that most of those young offenders, those young learners, were very, very high on resilience and very low on many of the other dimensions of learning. And when they looked at that and questioned it and began to try and understand it, they recognized that for many of the youngsters, their only strategy for dealing with pressurized situations or dealing with difficult situations was just to do more of what they were already doing. It was almost characterized by, if this door won't open, then I will just kick it harder. If if I'm not being heard, I will shout louder. And it was interesting to think that that sense of perseverance and determination in that situation was an illustration of perhaps a lack of the behavioral flexibility and the mental agility that was listed as one of the characteristics of real resilience. So as in all of these things, there's that sense, I think, of balancing the extremes and knowing that we need a combination of things. And this exercise, challenging assumptions, enables us to explore some of those kinds of issues. The third little exercise that I want to talk to you about is an activity that we call mystery object. Again, some of you may be familiar with this. And the idea behind this exercise is that a key component in becoming more resilient is being able to look at an issue from a different perspective, to be able to take a different view of the situation you find yourself in, to be able to look at a problem and say, what I'm doing at the moment isn't working, or I'm not achieving the results that I want, so perhaps I need to approach this in a different way. We might call it reframing. It's about creative solution finding. And in many situations, that process can be helped through collaboration. As I've said on the slide here, using the power of diverse views and challenging questions to break patterns and develop innovative solutions. Very often, when people are stuck, they start to lose the belief that they will be able to find a way out of this, or they start to believe that, that there is no answer to this particular issue. So this exercise, which is a short activity usually done in pairs, is to explore creative collaboration and how helpful that can be in building both the commitment that we talked about before, commitment being that connection with other people and staying engaged with the situation you're in, but also some of the mental agility and the different perspectives that will help in developing resilience. So again, we use simple resources and materials here. We have little objects, things that are unfamiliar to people. We call them the mystery objects. And we encourage people to work in pairs, with one taking on the role of a coach. Coincidentally, this enables people to develop some coaching skills and some techniques that may help other people to build their own resilience. We ask the coach to work with their partner as a designer, and the designer is targeted with trying to find new applications or a new product idea that emerges from the stimulus of the little object. The coach takes a pure coaching role, asking questions, encouraging, summarizing, but not putting any content, not putting any advice or suggestion into the process. If the coaching is done well and it's supported by some good facilitation, the person doing the designing begins to use some of the techniques that, again, we know will help in building the resilience. So, for example, positive self-talk, the avoidance of what I might call self-editing, that voice in your head saying, no, I won't say that because it's a stupid idea, or no, I won't say that because nobody's going to listen anyway. So they're encouraged through the coaching process to voice ideas, to think about possibilities. They're encouraged to look at the object in different ways. So rather than seeing something that looks like a little plastic valve or a fishing float, what are they actually seeing? Describe it. Think about possible applications of it. Look at it from a different perspective. Don't look at it from the fact it's made of plastic. Look at it from the fact that it has an interesting hole through the middle, which has potential for multiple uses. As they're coached, they're encouraged not just to respond to the first idea they have, but to continue to explore multiple options, to come up with different ideas. They're encouraged to continue to develop their ideas, not to say, oh, this is good enough, but encouraged by the coaches to say, so what could we do to that to improve it, to make it better, to develop a more interesting product? And again, this creative collaboration has some interesting results. I see people move over a 10-15 minute process from saying, I will never come up with a good idea here, or I'm not creative, or I can't think of a way that this is anything other than a little bent piece of metal. Within a 10 or 15 minute process will very often have achieved an idea which they find a very satisfying result. And they do that through the support of the coaches, the questioning, the different perspectives. And again, I think that this is a really important part of resilience, this sense of being able to step back and say, stop looking at this situation just in the way you're looking at it now and think about how you could view this in a different way. And then finally, I want to just briefly introduce a concept that we use, and it's back to imagery again, as we did at the beginning, to think about how the imagery can help people to think about their future learning and what I've called here sustained resilience. I may have had a short-term success. I may have dealt well with a particular situation, but how do I actually maintain that and continue it? And the two real elements I think that are part of that come back to learning and realistic goal setting and the idea of positive thought and action. So we encourage people wherever possible to take time out, to be able to stop what they're doing, however busy they may be, however urgent the deadlines may be, to step back and to reflect. And to try to reflect without an emotional response to the experience. We need to recognize the emotion we felt at any particular time, because that's part of the data we use to help us to learn from the situation. So yes, recognize that I felt angry in that situation, but step back from that anger and think about what it felt like, what was actually going on in as objective a way as possible. And there are lots of techniques that help with this, and I'm not an expert in them. Many of you will know more about those than I do. But examples are things like the NLP techniques of reframing, deliberately looking for a different perspective, and dissociation. That ability to step almost out of yourself and look at yourself as if you were someone else, to see and notice what's going on for you. And then techniques of mental rehearsal, positive self-talk. In order to facilitate that, because sometimes people respond well to a stimulus, we use a concept of journey mapping, voyage mapping. And in the image here, you can see a couple of people working together in a kind of coaching context to use this. It's the world accepted metaphor of a journey, a voyage. Where am I going from here? How do I take some learning with me? What do I need to be thinking of now that will help me when I come across the difficult situations that I'm bound to face in the future? And again, the imagery on the page here, whole range of different cartoon pictures that illustrate some of the things that might represent stresses and problems. So burnout, how do I cope with being overworked, overstressed? Icebergs, the problems that lie ahead, maybe I can see them on the horizon, but I don't know how big they are, I don't know how serious they are. The fog, I'm not clear about where I'm going, I can't see the wood for the trees, I can't see through the mist that surrounds me. Maybe the goal isn't well defined. But then on the positive side, we also have imagery that represents the things that will help people to deal with those stresses and pressures. So the idea of the supplier bringing resources onto the boat here. What can other people provide for me? Where do I look for the resources that I need and the support that I need? What's in the treasure chest or the toolbox? Maybe this is skills that I have, expertise that I have, situations I've dealt with before, the knowledge that I've gathered from them. Maybe it is those personal strengths and qualities that I identified using the strengths-based approach. Maybe it is contact with the wider world, communication, networking. Maybe it's being up in the crow's nest and looking out and anticipating what lies ahead, lifting my head to the horizon rather than being completely bogged down in the situation that I find myself in at the moment. And one of the things that we find helps at RSVP Design is giving people that sense of the journey ahead, anticipating the difficulties. We can't plan to deal with all of them, but what we can do is think about what we have available to us, the tools, the techniques, the strategies. And as I wind up this part of the webinar and think about the main messages that I really want to get across there, it's that strong sense that if we can help people to learn, if we can help them to reflect, if we can help them to get out of the situation that they find themselves in and step back, even just for a short time, and be aware of what's happening, and then we can start to give them some practical skills and strategies for dealing with that pressure, particularly in a professional workplace, we're doing them a service in helping to build their personal resilience. I haven't touched on so many things that are part of managing stress, so many of the more psychological aspects, because I've focused very much here on being a training provider, thinking about things that we can do in a work context. So I hope that there's something in there that you found interesting, that you can start to see the connections between experiential learning and developing some of the skills and competences that we believe will help people to be more resilient,